I didn't know who he was. No one did. But that morning, with so many bodies begging for help, it was him my hands went to first, as if my soul already knew something my mind couldn't yet understand. There are choices we make without thinking, and sometimes it's those very choices that shape the rest of our lives, not because they were right or wrong, but because they change us from the inside out, like water carving through stone. The war was loud on the outside, but what haunted me most was the silence inside, the silence that comes when you have to choose who lives and who doesn't. I was a nurse. I'd been trained to follow protocol, to prioritize those with the best odds, to be rational, efficient, fast. But that cold morning, high up in the Italian mountains, with smoke from the bombing still thick in the air, something in me, an ancient whisper maybe, made me kneel beside an unconscious man, a complete stranger. He was lying on his side, covered in blood and mud, no ID, no visible rank. Others were calling out to me, wounded men who maybe had better chances. But I stayed, pressing down on the wound in his chest, whispering words I couldn't even hear myself anymore. And even now, at 88 years old, I still ask myself, what pulled me to him? Instinct? Fate? Or a secret only time could ever explain? My name is Hazel Montgomery. I live in Denver now, in an old house I share with my best friend. She was a nurse, too, back in those Italian hills, where we learned to hear death the way you hear a ticking clock. My days are slow now. I drink tea at 4, with the same lemon cookies we used to bake at camp when we had just enough flour and just enough hope. The radio hums softly, and sometimes the news feels like echoes of that war, just with new faces. People ask me why I tell these stories now. Maybe because time doesn't wait, or maybe because that secret, that moment I chose to save that stranger first, has never let me sleep in peace. There's a kettle on the stove and 2 teacups set on the table. Sit here with me, sweetheart. This story's been quiet for far too long. If it stirs something in you, you don't have to say a word. Just let me know you heard. And if you feel like it, subscribe to the channel. Around here, nobody has to be strong all the time. Waking up at that base felt like waking up inside a sick body. Everything groaned. The damp ground creaked beneath our boots, the wooden walls cracked with the icy wind rolling down from the hills, and the torn canvas that barely covered part of the barracks fluttered like a tired lung. War made noise even when it was quiet, and that morning, the silence felt like it was mourning something that hadn't happened yet. A thick fog draped the field, like the sky was trying to shield its eyes from what was coming. The smell of wet earth blended with dried blood and grease, and I, like I did every single day, tied my white scarf around my neck like a cloth armor. That was still a time when I believed I could make a difference. Every shift, every bandage, every breath I helped preserve. I clung to the illusion that I was saving the world one body at a time. But it was also the time I learned that war has an appetite. It doesn't settle for open wounds. It wants the smaller deaths too. The loss of faith, the draining of the soul, the fear of closing your eyes at night. And that day was one of those. A day where everything felt grayer, wetter, heavier than usual. The trucks arrived earlier than expected. 3 of them, open, barely covered with makeshift tarps, carrying men in silence. The silence of the living who didn't yet know if they'd stay that way. And the moment the first bodies were unloaded, like sacks of flour that still breathed with effort, I knew it was going to be a long day. I started my shift as always, assessing wounds, prioritizing by severity, following protocol. But it didn't take long for me to realize protocol wouldn't help me that day, Between muffled groans and the shuffle of hurried commands, my eyes locked, not on a face, but on a shape. A body thrown sideways, almost buried under another. He wasn't groaning, wasn't moving. No ID on his uniform, already soaked in mud and blood. But something pulled me toward him. I can't explain it. It was like there was an invisible cord tying my chest to his. And before I even knew it, my knees were in the dirt. My hands were on his chest. He was cold, but there was still a pulse. Faint, but there. Other soldiers were screaming for help. One of them, a boy from Alabama with a leg hanging on by a thread of flesh, grabbed my arm. "Please," he said, eyes wide with the kind of fear that makes you forget how to exist. But I stayed, pressing down on the stranger's wound, closing my eyes like maybe that would be enough to protect him. I've never forgiven myself for making that boy wait, but I've never once regretted staying with the stranger, because there was something in that war story that hadn't been told yet. And I could feel, in the smell of the earth, in the tremble of my hands, in the muffled beat of my own heart, that he carried a secret, something that could change everything if I could just keep him alive. And that cold morning, with the fog hiding even our shadows, he was the one my instincts told me to trust first. The first thing I noticed when he finally opened his eyes was that he hadn't expected to still be alive. There was no shock, no gratitude, not even panic. Just that hollow stare, like someone who had already run through every emotion and was now stuck in a place where none of them made sense. He looked at me like I was a painful mirage. And he stayed like that, just staring, until the weight of the world made him close his eyes again. That's when I understood that even though his body was there with me, part of him was still back there, wherever there was. The days that followed were the quietest I'd ever lived through in that war. I tended to him between avalanches of new wounded. His condition was serious but stable, and the blood we cleaned never seemed to stop. I'd sit beside his cot on those freezing nights, when the post finally settled down, and I'd listen to his breathing like it was a story yet to be written. I was never afraid of ghosts, you know. But something about that man felt haunted, even in flesh and bone. A kind of presence that made absence feel even sharper. I asked his name once, twice, 3 times. He never answered. It wasn't muteness. It was a choice. I knew how to tell when someone was too hurt to speak, but his silence was different. It was a kind of shield, like saying a single word might open a door he'd never be able to shut again. The others in the infirmary started calling him the Nameless One. Nervous jokes, hushed suspicions. Some said he might be a spy, that maybe he wasn't even one of ours. You really think a man with no name just shows up like that without carrying something worse than a chest wound? I heard someone whisper behind the canvas one night, but I refused to listen, because even in silence, that man spoke louder than most people screaming in pain. There was a moment I thought I heard something from him. I had just changed the bandage on his shoulder, a deep gash that kept bleeding even with stitches. My hands were cold, and when they touched his skin, his whole body tensed. A whisper left his lips, or at least I thought it did. An incomplete word. I don't know if it was water, soul, or just air slipping out. But the way he turned slightly, like he was trying to move away from a memory, made my skin crawl, like he hadn't been touched by me, but by something he was trying to forget. As the days went by, I started to feel this strange sense of familiarity between us, like we already knew each other, not from a real meeting, but from an old feeling, maybe from another life, or maybe from a shared kind of hurt. I'd dream about him sometimes, broken dreams, made of wet earth, bullets in the dark, and a scream that never managed to leave my throat. I'd wake up with my heart pounding like a retreat drum. It was strange. I had taken care of so many soldiers before. Young, old, panicked, dying. But none of them ever left me like this. Restless, even in moments of stillness. The emotional story unfolding between us didn't have a shape yet. It was just this quiet bond, this knot between two kinds of loneliness, pressed together by war. And even though I didn't know why yet, I already knew. There was a secret buried deep inside him, something that made him hide his own name like it was the last piece of himself worth protecting. And deep down, I didn't know if I was trying to save him from death or from himself. There was a small detail, almost invisible, that started bothering me more and more. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. That kind of thing happens when you haven't slept properly in days. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. It was his uniform, the fabric, the stitching, even the shades. They didn't quite match the ones we received from the American Army in that region. It was similar, sure, enough to fool a distracted glance. But I had seen hundreds, maybe thousands of uniforms. I knew how to spot when something was improvised, repurposed, or disguised. And his wasn't just unusual. It was altered. The name patch had been ripped off, then sewn back on, then torn off again. And there was a scar on his shoulder, old already healed, that didn't align with the kind of training or combat injuries our men faced out there. It was a clean, curved line, almost surgical. So unlike the messy, shrapnel-filled wounds we dealt with every day. That unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I was raised to trust what I saw. But I'd also learned war could make you see ghosts where there were none. So I kept quiet, kept caring for him just like I did with all the others. But I started watching more closely. Every breath, every flinch when someone touched him, every tiny twitch of pain or tension. One night, the rain hit hard. Hail pounding like it was trying to tear the sky open. Inside the base, the cold crept in through every crack and turned our bones into glass. And it was during that storm that I saw something different. He was trembling, but not from the cold. It was a deeper kind of shake, the kind that starts in the chest and spreads down the arms like a physical memory of something unspeakable. His hands clenched into fists, his teeth ground together, his jaw locked tight. He looked like he was reliving something, like he was back in a place the rest of us couldn't see. I touched his shoulder and whispered, "You're safe now. You're with me." And for the first time, he responded. He opened his eyes, stared right into mine, and murmured something I couldn't make out. It wasn't English. It was another language, fast, whispered. Maybe Italian, maybe German, but not ours. And that chilled me to the bone. I went back to my little corner that night and just sat there on the edge of my cot, staring at the wooden wall like it might give me answers. What kind of man was he? American? A deserter? An infiltrator? Or just another broken fragment of a war where no one was ever just one thing? The question gnawed at me. And yet something inside me still believed in him. I can't explain it. My heart. It didn't pull away. Not even with the strange clues, the silence, the half-formed words. Because something was there. A whole war story written across his body. Maybe just waiting for someone to read it. One day, while adjusting his pillow, I felt something hard sewn into it. Like something was hidden between the fabric and the stuffing. A piece of paper? A scrap of cloth? I didn't have the courage to open it. I just smoothed it over with my hand, pretended not to notice, and kept going with my work. But in that moment, I knew. There was far more behind those quiet eyes than I could have ever imagined. The infirmary was a cramped makeshift space where everything blended together. The sharp scent of ether, the stale smell of sweat, wet leather, and that thin layer of hope that only shows up when fear has nothing left to say. Every bed held a war story, but his felt suspended in time, like it was waiting for an ending no one dared to write. While the other soldiers cried for their mothers, prayed out loud, or rambled about home, he stayed quiet. He breathed like he was ashamed of the sound, and that, more than any wound, left me uneasy. Each morning I'd wipe his face with a white cloth, just like I did for all of them. But with him, I always took a little longer. I don't know if it was the warmth of his skin or the hollowness in his eyes, but something in that simple act made me feel closer. I folded the cloth carefully, always the same way. One fold for each day survived. And even if he said nothing, I could see, in the slight shifts of his gaze, the way the corner of his mouth twitched when the fabric touched his forehead, that he felt it. That maybe, somewhere deep inside, that gentleness was breaking through a layer of silence. But as the days passed, the questions that followed me around started to weigh heavier. Why wasn't he speaking yet? Why hadn't anyone come looking for him? Why were there no records, no ID, not even a scribbled note in his pockets? Just a body laid out among so many others, as if he were just another name lost in the smoke. But he wasn't just another one. I felt it in the way my stomach twisted every time I approached him, like my body recognized something my mind still refused to admit. So, I started looking closer. I studied his fingers. Long, steady, but with faint stains under the nails. Dirt. Maybe. But it could have also been ink. Did he write? Was he a journalist? Or was I just inventing stories to fill the silence, trying to turn pain into mystery? One night I woke to the distant sound of bombs. I glanced over and saw him with his eyes open, not sleeping, not moving, just staring at the ceiling. I lay there on my cot, pretending to be asleep too. But then I saw it. His hand reached slowly for his pillow. His fingers touched the exact spot where I had once felt that strange lump sewn inside. And he just stayed there still, his eyes fixed on the void. That's when I knew. He knew. He knew what was in there. He knew I might have noticed. But he didn't say anything, didn't push me away, didn't challenge me. He just existed. That's the thing about war. It puts people in the same room, under the same falling sky, and expects you to decide who's worth trusting. But trust doesn't grow from words. It's born from feeling, from the kind of silence that holds its own weight. And despite everything, I felt it. I felt there was a secret buried there, stitched in fine thread, hidden between the fibers of that pillow and of his chest. And even then, I didn't ask, because there are questions we only ask when we already know the answer. And by then, I wasn't ready to hear it. Silence was rare in war. Even when there were no bombs or screams, there was still that sharp, invisible sound only those who've lived through it can recognize. The sound of waiting. In the mornings, birds almost never came. Sometimes one or two dared to flutter nearby, but they always left quickly, as if they knew that place no longer belonged to nature. But that day, there was real silence. No attacks, no sirens, no trucks rolling in. The nurse on night watch with me said, God must have taken the day off. But I knew better. It was just a pause. The kind of breath pain takes before hitting harder. In the infirmary, everyone seemed more at ease. Some soldiers slept without fever dreams. Others ate for the first time in 2 days. And he, the stranger, the nameless one, the man my hands had chosen to say first, he had his eyes open. He was looking at me. really looking, like he had finally come back from wherever he'd been trapped. I sat beside him, and like I did every morning, I wiped his face with the folded cloth. But this time, when I touched his temple, I felt moisture that wasn't from a fever. It was a tear. He was crying, but the way he cried hurt more than screams. No trembling chin, no sobs. Just a single line of water trailing down, timid like it was ashamed to be seen. I didn't ask why. Instead, I held his hand. That wasn't something I usually did. Not by choice, but out of fear. Fear of attachment. Fear of not being able to let go later. But in that moment, it felt right. And when our fingers touched, I felt a warmth that wasn't from skin. It was memory, longing, pain. Something settled between us in the silence of that touch. And he squeezed back. Just once, briefly. But it was enough. Enough for me to understand that there was life in him. A whole life, cracked, buried, but still beating. That night, I wrote something in my notebook I still keep to this day. He cried, and it was the loudest sound I've ever heard. But what broke me wasn't the tear. It was what came after. Later that evening, when the night shift had taken over, and I was walking back to my tent with dirt on my boots and too many thoughts to sleep, the new nurse, a young girl from Texas, fresh-faced and nervous, called me over softly, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I found this in his shirt pocket while I was dressing the wound," she said. "Do you think it was his?" It was a letter, or part of one, smudged, unreadable in many places. But what I could make out made me stop breathing, and the words written there, they weren't in English. That piece of paper, stained with blood and rain, scribbled in the frantic, uneven handwriting of someone writing in either haste or despair, wasn't just a letter. It was a fragment of identity, a loose piece from a puzzle no one dared to finish. I took it with me to the makeshift mess hall, where the kettle was almost always boiling. I laid the letter on the rough wooden table beside my metal cup, and just stared at it. The words meant nothing to my mind. But my body reacted in a way I couldn't explain. It was like those curved, heavy, almost musical letters stirred something in me. A chill at the back of my neck, a knot in my stomach. A memory that wasn't mine, but somehow felt like it was. I couldn't place the language. It wasn't Italian. It wasn't German. There was a softness to it, an intimacy, something Slavic maybe, or from the Eastern Mediterranean, something older. I don't know. And truthfully, maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was how I felt when my fingers touched that damp paper. It was like I was touching his silence itself. The spaces between the words said more than the legible parts. Because where language fails, the soul invents. And mine conjured images. I don't know if they were real or imagined. Of a place with olive trees at dusk. Of a woman wearing a scarf like mine tied around her neck. Of a barefoot child playing in a courtyard of pale stone. Images that arrived with smells. Fresh bread. Skin warmed by sun, crushed jasmine between fingers. I went back to the infirmary with the paper tucked into the pocket of my apron. When I reached his bedside, I could feel something had shifted. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't fully awake either. His breathing was heavier, his eyes half open, like he was stuck in a difficult dream. I sat beside him and gently pulled the letter from my pocket. I didn't show it. I just let it rest on my lap. I waited, and then slowly, he turned his head. His eyes met mine, and for a second I knew. He understood. He knew what it was. He knew I had read it, or at least tried. But he didn't speak. He didn't change his expression. He just exhaled deeply, like someone accepting that a buried thing had surfaced again. I wanted to give the letter back, but something stopped me. Instinct, maybe the same one that had pulled me to him that first morning. Instead, I folded it carefully, placed it back in my pocket, and resumed my daily ritual like it was the most natural thing in the world. I adjusted my white scarf around my neck, dampened the cloth, and wiped his forehead gently. He closed his eyes, and for that brief moment, he looked at peace. In the days that followed, I hid the letter between the pages of my notebook, where I'd scribble pieces of what I saw, what I felt, and what I couldn't share with anyone. And even though I couldn't understand a single sentence, I reread every line like someone trying to decode their own fate. Because in that fragile piece of paper, there was more than just language. There was an emotional story. There was a secret, one that didn't belong to me yet, but somehow already felt like it did. It only happened because one of the supply crates fell. We were reorganizing the dressing corner, taking advantage of a lull in the stream of wounded. War sometimes gave us these brief moments, not out of mercy, but to make us let our guard down. The wooden box slipped off the makeshift shelf and crashed to the floor, spilling bottles of iodine, cotton, scissors, and small forgotten belongings of soldiers who had already been evacuated or buried. As I knelt to gather everything, I saw it. A thin frame, worn at the edges, an old picture frame with a cracked corner of glass. Inside, a sepia-toned photograph, the kind that moisture slowly eats away. 3 men side by side, in uniform. One of them was him. The same quiet eyes, the same shape of the jaw. Only this time he was smiling, a soft, almost shy smile, but real. He looked younger, maybe 3 or 4 years before the war. On the back of the photo, handwritten in strong penmanship, Skopje, summer of 1938. The word Skopje chilled me. I didn't know exactly where it was, but it sounded foreign, distant. And suddenly, everything began to connect, crooked and unavoidable. The letter in a strange language, the clean surgical scar, the silence that wasn't pain, but protection. I went back to the infirmary with the photo tucked inside my apron pocket. The bass was quieter that day, and the sound of an old waltz playing on the portable radio floated through the room like perfume on a letter from long ago. He was sitting up, which was rare. The doctors had cleared him to stay upright for short stretches. When I walked in, his eyes found mine right away. I sat beside his cot. I didn't say anything. I simply pulled out the folded photo and handed it to him. For a few seconds, he didn't move, just stared. But then something shifted in his face. A muscle in his jaw twitched ever so slightly. His eyes filled with water. He turned his head like he didn't want me to see. But I saw. I saw everything. I saw the weight of a life bound by silence. I saw the recognition of a past he could no longer deny. And I saw the pain of someone who'd carried his own name, like a wound, for too long. I didn't ask him anything. I just said, "That's you, isn't it?" He nodded, slowly, barely, then whispered a single word. "Jovan." It was the first time I'd heard his voice. It was his name. That moment hit me like an emotional bullet. Not because of the revelation, but because of how it happened. So restrained, so intimate. Like he wasn't just saying his name, but everything he'd lost by keeping it hidden for so long. And if that stirred something in you, then listen all the way to the end. Because there's something here that might belong to you, too. From that day forward, he was no longer the nameless one to me. But what I didn't know yet was that by learning his name, I had stepped into the center of an old secret. One even he wasn't sure he could trust someone else to hold. After he told me his name, Jovan, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the revelation of an identity. It was as if by speaking those 2 syllables aloud, he'd cracked open a small gap in the wall where he kept all his truths locked away. For the first time I saw him as a man, not just a patient. And that's when a different kind of war began, a quieter one, invisible, made of half-sentences, lingering glances, and silences we no longer knew whether to interpret as protection or punishment. The kind of war that lives in what is felt, but can't be named. The next day, I brought a dictionary into the infirmary. It wasn't reliable. One of those old ones with limited translations between English, French, German, and Italian. But I needed to try. I wanted to show him that I saw him, that I was listening, even when he said nothing. I pointed to words and asked him to repeat them. At first he dodged, reluctant. But little by little, between one bandage and the next, he began to speak in fragments. Sometimes in broken English, sometimes in a language I guessed was Macedonian. But what struck me wasn't the language. It was what he chose to say. Simple things, yes. But each one carried a weight, a sadness that had aged in silence. He spoke of a childhood in the mountains, a grandfather who carved spoons from wood, a woman named Mila who sang while cutting figs. Nothing about war, nothing about battles, just pieces of a world that felt as far away as peace itself. One night, through broken words, hand gestures, and the heavy language of the eyes, he told me he had run. He didn't say exactly from where or when, but he mentioned being hunted, said he wasn't a soldier, not at first, that he'd been pulled into the war like so many others, one among thousands, but with something extra, forged documents, fear of the past, and a name he could no longer use. And in that moment, I understood the gravity of what he was carrying. He was hiding. There, among our soldiers, beneath our flag. Wounded, yes, but also disguised. By the book, I should have reported him. That was the protocol. That was the logic. But logic doesn't tend to wounds opened by the heart. And in that instant, with the barn creaking around us and his breath beside mine, I realized it wasn't the first time I'd broken the rules for him. I continued treating his body, but I also began tending to his story. I held on to each sentence like someone gathering pieces of a shattered glass. I knew I couldn't put it all back together, but something in me believed it was worth trying. And maybe, deep down, I was trying to run from something too. From who I was before the war. From all the choices that had made me feel less alive. He told me the name Jovan belonged to his father, and that he'd been registered under another, one he never wanted to use. But Jovan was who he truly was inside, the name that screamed in his dreams. And it was that name I began to whisper while dressing his wounds. Because there, between one battlefield and the next, what was left of us was this, a thread of humanity buried in the mud and fear. And in that wordless confession, between clean sheets and dirty pasts, I realized the emotional story I was living wasn't just his. It was mine too. I started paying closer attention to his pillow. That strange lump I'd felt weeks before, back when I didn't even know his name. Now, after everything he'd revealed, and all that he still hadn't, my intuition no longer whispered. It screamed. Late at night, while the camp slept under the distant sound of thunder, or maybe explosions, I decided it was time. I waited until I was sure he was asleep. That deep, heavy sleep only a body completely worn down can manage. I took a small nail scissors from my personal kit and carefully began opening the seam along the side of the pillow. With the tips of my fingers, I pulled out a folded scrap of cloth. Inside it, wrapped in faded thread, was a tiny yellowed note, meticulously folded. A delicate handwriting, almost artistic, written in black ink with fine strokes. But again, not in English. It was the same language I'd seen in the hidden letter. This time, though, there was something else. A symbol drawn beside the text, an upside-down triangle with a flower in the center. It felt ritualistic. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just a love letter. It wasn't a keepsake. It was an instruction, or a code, or a promise. And even if I couldn't read it with my eyes, my body read it. Like a mournful melody played at a frequency only the heart can hear. I kept the note with me, trembling, as if I'd stolen something sacred. When I returned to his bedside, he was already awake. He didn't say a word, just looked at the pillow, now slightly deflated, then looked at me. I knew he knew, and he knew I wasn't going to give it back. Not yet. The tension in that moment wasn't made of anger. It was made of fear. The kind of fear that settles in your chest when you realize that knowing too much makes you part of something you were never meant to touch. War has its borders, but none more dangerous than the one between those who witness and those who get involved. In the days that followed, he barely spoke, slipped back into that old silence. But it was a different kind now, not the silence of physical pain. It was mourning. Mourning for a secret that had shifted, that had come out of hiding, and now breathed too close to me. I began to dream about that flower inside the triangle. In one dream, it bled black ink and melted across my chest. I woke with a metallic taste in my mouth, and with a terrible, gut-deep feeling that that note wasn't just about him. It was about something that hadn't happened yet. Something that involved me more than I could understand. And it was only much later that I realized that note had never been sewn in to be found. It had been sewn in to be buried with him. Some wounds don't show up on X-rays. They don't bleed, don't swell, but they eat you from the inside out like slow rust. From the moment I found the sewn-in note inside Jovan's pillow, I began to see his reactions in a different light. Every glance he avoided, every prolonged silence, every subtle gesture I once assumed was physical pain, now spoke a different language. The language of someone who knows they're being uncovered against their will. I tried to keep busy, spent more time tending to other patients, reorganizing supplies, scrubbing gauze pads with more force than necessary. But it didn't matter. He was in everything. In the scent of freshly washed sheets, in the breeze slipping under the tent flap that made my white scarf flutter, in the way I scribbled names into my notebook and then scratched them out angrily, as if that would quiet the doubt. One morning I asked the head nurse of our unit to change my shifts. I needed less time there, just a few fewer hours a day. She looked at me with surprise but didn't ask why. Maybe she saw in my face what I hadn't yet admitted, the burden of holding a secret that isn't yours, but chooses you anyway. That same day, when I returned to the barracks after my shift, I found something on my cot that hadn't been there before. A small worn envelope, my name written on it. Misshapen, awkward letters, like someone trying to imitate English for the first time. Inside there was only one piece of paper. This time, no foreign script, just one sentence, one question. If you knew who I was, would you still have saved me? I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not out of fear, not out of anger, but exhaustion, from finding myself in a place where there are no right answers, where every choice wounds someone, including yourself. That question became my mirror. It echoed every time I washed surgical tools, every time I changed a dressing, every time I heard someone say, "You're gonna be fine," while knowing they wouldn't be. By that point, the war wasn't between nations anymore. It was between parts of me, between the woman I was trained to be and the woman I was becoming beside him. I didn't know who Jovan had been before he came into my care. Soldier, deserter, rebel, killer, martyr. War is so thick with gray areas that any of those answers could have been true, or all of them at once. But even without knowing, I knew the one thing that mattered. He had chosen me, trusted me enough to leave that envelope. And that, by itself, was an act of courage. Or maybe, of goodbye. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the infirmary door, scarf tied tight around my neck like a useless shield, watching the dark. Because when truth begins to wound deeper than any bullet, you learn to carry invisible injuries like sacred relics. And I knew that war story wasn't leaving me anytime soon. Sometimes war gave us a pause. Not a real one, but the kind that tricks you. 2 full days passed without new wounded arriving. Only reconnaissance patrols returning sweaty and frustrated. The air was thick with waiting. And somehow, that was worse. Because the body rests, but the mind doesn't. The mind hears whispers of what's coming. It creates monsters in the dark. And for me, everything had already turned dark since that note. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just another war story among many. Not when his name was now written in the corner of my page, Jovan. In delicate letters I kept crossing out and rewriting over and over. It was as if writing it was my way of not forgetting, but also a way of not fully admitting. I stared at those letters and wondered, what does that name really hold? Because names, sometimes, are like locked boxes. We think we know what's inside, but we only find out when we open them. He was recovering well, physically. Already walking short distances through the camp, leaning on a makeshift cane. The other soldiers watched him with that mix of curiosity and unease. No one called him the Nameless One anymore. But they didn't call him anything at all. It was like his past was a mirror no one wanted to look into. His presence made people uncomfortable, not because of anything he said or did, but because of what he represented. A familiar face that was also unknown. A body I had saved, and at the same time a shadow of something no one wanted to remember. He avoided me during those days. Not out of disdain. I knew that. It was fear. The kind of fear that makes you hide even from the one who reached out to save you. But it was in that quiet space between us that something strange happened. One of the strangest things of that whole season. A visit. An officer. Foreign. Not very tall. Dressed far too well for the mud around us. He spoke Italian with an accent. Asked to review the medical records of our ward, claiming he was doing a verification of compliance with international triage protocol. Lies. We all knew. He never said who he was looking for. But when he walked past the cots, his eyes paused on Jovan. Just for a second. But it was enough. I saw it. Jovan saw it. And in that moment, without a single word exchanged, I understood. Someone was looking for him. And that man, behind the accent, the leather briefcase, the cold eyes, knew exactly where to look. My stomach twisted for the rest of the day. I didn't eat, didn't sip my tea. I just wrote in my notebook. Angry, hurt, desperate in a way I didn't know how to name. If he leaves, I won't just carry his absence with me. I'll carry everything I've become since I chose to save him. That night, the rain returned. It tapped softly against the canvas roof, as if the sky itself was hesitating. I sat staring at the dark entrance of the infirmary, waiting for him to appear. And when he did, he wasn't alone. She looked far too out of place for that setting, as if she'd stepped out of another season entirely. The scarf over her hair was a red so vivid it almost pulsed against the dull gray of the camp, a fabric far too delicate for the damp cold around us. Her clothes were plain but precise, her boots clean, impossibly so, like the road to us had been paved just for her. And in her hands, what struck me most, a rose, red, perfect, unbruised, unsullied. A rose that had no business surviving that far into the war. Jovan walked in beside her, his step slow, almost reverent. His gaze stayed downcast, and when he saw me, he hesitated. The woman looked at me with curiosity, then with something that felt, for a breath, like recognition, as if she had heard of me. And then she said in a heavy accent, but with carefully chosen words, "You're Hazel." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, almost an accusation. I nodded slowly. She smiled with sadness, a smile that reminded me of broken glass, beautiful, but dangerous. She said she had come for him, that he could no longer remain here, that his time in our camp was over. Jovan didn't speak. He just stood behind her, as if his will no longer belonged to him. I tried to stay composed, swallowed the heat rising in my throat like oil on a flame. I wanted to ask who she was. Why now? Why like this? But I knew it wasn't the time. She handed me an envelope, thick paper, heavy, sealed with wax. "It's for you." He wrote it. My hands trembled as I took it, but I didn't open it there. I didn't want them to see my face collapse. They left just after sunset. No ceremony, no explanation. Just got into a truck that wasn't ours, with a man in a black beret none of us had ever seen. And they vanished down the muddy road like they had never existed. Like they'd been nothing more than a fever dream between one wound and another. I returned to my tent with the rose in my hand. She had left it on my table. It no longer looked vibrant. In the dim lamplight it appeared darker, heavy, nearly purple, nearly death. I sat down, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. Inside only a few lines, written with effort, but in a handwriting I could recognize without hesitation. "You were my refuge inside the fire. I never deserved your kindness, but I lived because of it. And that's more than I ever hoped for in a world like this. Take care of what you do not yet understand, because silence also belongs to someone. Jovan." I read it once, twice, 10 times, and even with all the questions burning in me, only one sentence kept circling in my mind. Take care of what you do not yet understand. The rose, the sewn-in note, the woman with the red scarf. None of it made sense. But what he left me with was the weight of a secret that wasn't mine, but now lived in me. Topic 13. The ashes on the edge of the letter and the silence that asked not to be told. It took me weeks to touch the envelope again. I had tucked it between the pages of my notebook, hidden like it was a relic or a trap. I didn't know what stopped me from rereading it. Maybe it was fear. Fear of realizing that final note held more truth than I was ready to face. Or maybe it was the certainty that he'd left me something to protect, not to understand. There are things that, once understood, leave you unmoored. And at that point in the war, I was already standing on the very little ground. It was a cold morning in November when the base commander called for me. He held a sheet of paper and wore that stiff, detached look of someone about to deliver news they'd rather ignore. He said they'd need to transfer patients and staff. An international inspection team was coming. Security verification, he said. There are important eyes on this region. But I knew it was about him, or rather, about the trace he left behind. I returned to my tent and pulled the envelope from its hiding place. When I opened it again, I noticed something I had missed before. Along the inner flap of the paper there were faint ashes. A darkened edge, barely there, as if the letter had been held near flame and pulled back just in time. A chill ran through me. That wasn't carelessness. It was a symbol, a silent warning. And tucked next to the ash, I found a second note, much smaller, folded so tightly it looked like it had been written in a moment of panic. I unfolded it carefully. Tiny, sharp letters, different from the first, maybe written by someone else, or maybe by him, in another state entirely. The message this time was in English, just one sentence. There is a name that must not be spoken. Keep it silent, and it will keep you. I closed my eyes. My body reacted before my mind could process it. Breath quickened, hands cold. The scarf around my neck suddenly felt too tight. That wasn't poetry. That was instruction, a pact. And for the first time since Jovan had left, I felt true fear. Not the kind that came from bombs or gunfire, but the kind that came from the unseen, from whatever lingers around names that are never meant to be said aloud, from pacts that survive even at a distance. I could have handed over the note. I could have told Command everything, about the torn uniform, the hidden name, the woman with the rose. But I didn't, because something in me knew this wasn't just about him. It was about me, too. I had been chosen, not just as a nurse, but as a keeper. And maybe that started long before I pressed my shaking hands against his chest that morning. Maybe long before I even understood what it meant to save someone. But what he told me before he left, I never had the courage to repeat. Not even to myself. The base was decommissioned not long after. Men arrived in spotless uniforms, clipboards in hand, and eyes that didn't really see anyone. They walked between the remaining cots like they were inventory-checking crates, not lives. Every soul reduced to numbers, abbreviations, stamps. Some of us were reassigned, others discharged. And what once had been our daily rhythm of pain, mud, and small miracles turned to rubble, swept away under the pretext of strategic reorganization. I knew this day would come, but I didn't expect them to erase things the way they did, by erasing the traces. The first sign was the identification board. There had been a plaque listing all the soldiers treated there, living and lost, a thing we updated with care, almost like a ritual of dignity. One late afternoon, it vanished. No warning, no explanation. No one knew where it had gone. Then the medical files followed. Pages were missing, entire folders, including Jovan's. When I quietly asked one of the older nurses, she simply shook her head. Some things got buried faster than the dead. It tore something inside me. I couldn't accept that everything had been reduced to absence, that everything we lived through there, the tears, the trembling hands, the fear, the tenderness, could be erased from paper and official memory. But to the eyes of those in charge, he had never been there. And maybe that had always been the point, to silence it all until time could pass for forgetting. That's when I made a decision I carry with me to this day. I wrote, not to expose anything, not to shout, but to preserve, to stitch that story into myself with the same invisible thread he used inside his pillow. I spent days transcribing every detail, every glance that spoke louder than words, every movement, every pause that whispered truth. Then I packed the notebooks into boxes lined with cloth, alongside the white scarf I wore every day at that base. It aged with me, yellowed, but never lost its scent. Years later, when the war had become nothing but a chapter in school books, a historian found me, young, polite, the kind of polite that tries to mask digging for buried things. He asked me about a man, showed me a blurred photo, faded but unmistakable. It was Jovan. He said the name appeared linked to a network of deserters, that there were rumors Jovan had carried sensitive information, that maybe he had played a role in something much larger than any of us knew. He asked if I knew him, asked if I treated him. I said no, said the face didn't look familiar. He didn't seem convinced, but he thanked me, left, never came back, and when he was gone, I shut the door and cried, because denying Jovan meant denying the most alive part of my story. But it was the only way to keep him safe, because there was something in that story that didn't belong in a book, something that could only be passed from soul to soul. And I knew one day someone would come and need to hear it, even if they never knew the name. Time has a strange way of erasing voices but leaving the echoes behind. People think forgetting means erasing, but it doesn't. Forgetting is just pain changing places, and in my case it settled into every ordinary gesture, in the way I put water on to boil every afternoon, in how I fold my scarves with exact care, in how I avoid saying certain names, even when there's no one around to hear. Because some stories we don't tell, but they keep telling us. Years passed, decades. The Second World War became yellowed photographs, medals hanging in museums, a date for parades. But inside me, it still pulses like raw flesh beneath a scar. I'm no longer a nurse. I don't run from one cot to the next, trying to hold time together with gauze. Now, I sit with my pain, and I let it speak to me about what still lingers. So much has changed. The world spun forward. Countries changed names. Truths were rewritten 1,000 times by those who won. But Jovan's face remains untouched in my memory. And sometimes when the wind shifts strangely here in Denver, and the curtain in my living room moves just right, I almost see him standing there, like he did that last time, holding that red rose and saying everything he couldn't with his eyes. I never heard from him again. Don't know if he survived, if he returned to the place he was fleeing, if he built a new life under another name, another history. But I've always felt like he left something in me, something that can't be undone. And I'm not talking about guilt, though yes, that's there too. I mean a kind of bond that doesn't need words, a memory that breathes, a secret that, instead of weighing me down, holds me up. I've kept all the letters, the notebooks, the scorched note with the flower and the triangle. They're wrapped in old cloth, sleeping inside a wooden box beneath my bed. Sometimes I think about burning them, but I can't, because somehow that fire already passed through me, and I survived it. I was shaped by what I chose to hold on to, not by what I tried to forget. Maybe I failed in many ways. Maybe I broke too many rules, left too many questions unanswered, carried secrets that were never mine. But if someone were to ask me today, with the age I have, with my bones creaking like this chair I sit in, would you save him again? I would say yes, without hesitation. Because in that moment, with the sky gray and the bodies screaming, it was he who saved me too. He saved me from numbness, from routine, from emotional death. He reminded me there was still something in me that listened to whispers, that trusted what couldn't be explained. And that's why, even now, when I hear sounds in the middle of the night, soft footsteps like someone who knows the way, I don't get scared. I just close my eyes and say quietly, "If it's you, Jovan, the kettle's on, and the scarf is still white." Today, sitting in this armchair that creaks like my bones, watching the snow slowly cover the sidewalk in Denver, I think about that moment I chose him. That morning when everything was in chaos, and even without a name, without the right uniform, without any certainty at all. It was him my hands went to first. Maybe someone would call it a mistake, maybe a miracle. Even now, I'm not always sure. But with the years, I came to understand one thing. Some decisions don't come from logic. They rise from somewhere time doesn't reach. An ancient place, instinctual, where the heart speaks louder than fear. That's where the gesture came from. That's where the yes I gave him was born, without knowing who I was giving it to. War taught me how to measure wounds, to separate who had a chance from who didn't, to mask a trembling hand beneath the heat of duty. But what Jovan brought to me never fit within the rules. It was another kind of wound, one that doesn't bleed outward, but pulses inside for years, for decades. And it's that wound I've been trying to stitch together ever since. Some people think only stories with clear endings are worth telling. The ones who die, the ones who win, the ones who return. But there are stories like ours, ones that don't end, that stretch out like a shadow at the end of the day, even when no one's looking. A war story that, for me, was never about battles, but about that one quiet moment between two souls who recognized each other without ever having met. Because that's what it felt like. That somehow, Jovan and I already knew each other. Not by name, not by country, but by that quiet ache carried by those who bear the weight of survival. I never told anyone this. Never. Not out of fear. Out of reverence. Because some memories are like seeds. If you pull them from the soil too soon, they don't bloom. But now, in this chapter of life when I remember more than I expect, I felt it was time. Not to clarify, not to explain, but to let this story rest somewhere it no longer needs to hide. And if it touched something in you, maybe we've carried the same longing along different paths. Maybe you, too, once chose someone the world told you to forget. Maybe you've tucked away a name in the fold of a scarf. Maybe you know, as I do now, that what we choose to save often saves us right back. If this story found you in a quiet moment, stay. Let it sit with you. Let it look at you slowly. And if you feel like it, right below, tell me what name you still carry. Because sometimes all we need is someone willing to hear what was left between the words. And if you felt that thread between us, subscribe to the channel. Stay a while. Here we don't run from the past. We pour tea for it. And while the world spins out there, in here, memory still knows the way home.